Generally, when I do these videos these days, I tend to have one of two different mindsets when I get down to it. One is a sense of enthusiasm, of genuine, just, yes, I can't wait to talk about this. Half-Life 2 is a good example of that. Most of the Final Fantasy series I talked about, another good example of that. The several videos that are up and coming, such as the Zelda series or the Kingdom Hearts series, I'm also very much looking forward to. So there's this genuine, yes, I can't wait. Now, don't mistake me. That doesn't mean the other videos, which I'm about to mention, are videos that I am not enthusiastic about. It's just I approach those with a different air, which is to say, kind of a worry thing, really. Bioshock is without question one of those videos because I look at a game like this, which has already been commented on so much, and has already been dissected, and has already been analyzed by so much, to such an extensive degree by so many different people that I feel, what could I possibly add to the mix, you know? What else is there for me to say? I had this feeling when I was doing my Half-Life 1 review. It's like, what do I add to this, you know? What do I say to the world that Half-Life was a good game? I mean, duh, you know? As usual, I try to approach this in the same way I do every time I come across a game like that. Just in my usual fashion. You know, this is just me talking to the people who share interests, who share enthusiasm, and, you know, talking about a game that's awesome and trying to discuss it. So hopefully I will succeed to some extent or another here. But I admit I am rather nervous. First thing I really want to talk about with regards to Bioshock is their approach to philosophizing. Philosophizing. Actually, I'm not even sure that's the word either. The philosophy, okay? One of the interesting things that I've noticed in gaming especially, but this is true in all forms, such as movies, books, TV shows, that sort of thing, is there are going to be people out there who are going to pick apart certain parts of your work of fictional entertainment and say, well, this is obviously an allegory for blah. Now, sometimes things are an allegory. Sometimes, you know, it's something that's talking about something else, either obviously or subvertly, but most of the time, in my experience, percentage-wise, they're making something out of nothing, right? Thus, when it is very obvious that something is on display, that is being allegoricized, that's not a word, something is being used as an allegory, people tend to get really bent up over shape over that because it's obvious, apparent, and no one's denying it, right? I've heard a lot of arguments, genuine arguments, as well as genuine discussions about the approach Bioshock has towards philosophies. Okay, I'm not going to name any of the specifics because that's not the point of this, and you'll see why in a minute. Just let me build this up here a little bit. I'm going to use a more or less fictional example here. Let's say, yes, I know communism isn't fictional, but bear with me. Let's say I want to do a game in which there is a communist organization, and I want to portray that communist organization as the villain. Okay. Now I have several ways of doing this, but one of the more effective ways to be as inoffensive as possible is rather than have it be communism, have it be the extremes of communism. Okay? Now, let me explain that a little bit by backing up just a step or two. I made an erroneous comment quite some time ago during a Q&A, which basically amounted to, I don't care for animes. Now, I've actually been exposed to a very large number of animes, and in general, I don't care for most of them. So, the generalized saying, I don't care for animes, is something that I could say and be accurate relatively, but I was called out on that, and correctly so, because that is still a generalization. That's like saying, I don't like movies, or I don't like books, you know? And obviously, there's just a couple of degrees of separation from the severity there, but it's the same basic concept because anime is just another medium. There's no constants there, you know. Some of the things I tend to associate negatively with anime, well, I really should say past tense, but much when I was much younger, back in the Dragon Ball Z days, the several things that I have associated negatively with anime are things that I erroneously associated with anime because I was only exposed to like three or four back then, and as I stretched out and I found more, and I found a couple that I actually liked, I found a lot I didn't like. But the point I'm trying to get across here is that when you generalize like that, you automatically you're kind of automatically wrong, if you know what I mean. Now, let me also take a moment and say that there's nothing necessarily wrong with generalizing, despite what I just said, because life, anybody out there who's lived any number of years knows that life is so complicated, so dynamic, and so diverse that you literally have to generalize, or else you will spend 12 years trying to discuss whether or not you like this particular drink or not. this particular drink in this manner, and the way it was formed, and the way it was made, with the ingredients they had on hand, with the equipment they were using, and the condition it was in at the time, and the mood of the people, and the amount they decided to use, and how many seconds of one mix they were using with a mix of the other, and whether or not the styrofoam was affecting it. And you may think I'm being facetious here, and I guess I sort of am, so forgive me. But everything I just said is a very real variable into how this drink tastes. I could generalize and say, I like Sonic drinks, but that wouldn't be true. It would be mostly true. Now, I'm not saying this to pull out it technically. All I'm trying to say is that when you generalize when you generalize in order to categorize something because you don't want to go into the specifics, in my opinion, there's nothing really wrong with that. Again, I like Sonic drinks. Now, I don't like all Sonic drinks, but I tend to like Sonic drinks. And indeed, usually, I don't always do this correctly, because, I'm human just like the rest of you. But I tend to try and say, no, I just said it just now, I tend to like Sonic drinks. As in, the majority of the time, this generalization is true, okay? As opposed to just saying, all Sonic drinks are awesome. The thing I have against generalization in a negative light is when someone says something like, to use myself as the scapegoat here, I don't like animes, or if you prefer, all animes are bad, which is of course ludicrous because it's like saying all drinks are bad. Again, just like I said, this is me freely admitting my own fault here, but also pointing out that I have seen this so many times when someone will generalize and say all blah is bad, all FPSs are bad. That's one I've heard, for example, all first-person shooters, all American television is bad, all British television is bad. Which amuses me because most of the shows I enjoy are actually British. Go figure. But that kind of thing. I've seen so many generalizations in this that are used in order to put forth an extreme. Now, you cannot apply a generalization to an extreme. It literally does not work. It is not mathematically possible to diverge between the two because all you're doing is sounding stupid. It's like saying, I hate the moon. Why? Because it's white. Damn you, moon. Damn you. The whole moon is white and therefore I hate it. I know that's a ludicrous example, but that I have to say it like that so you get the point. No matter how you say it, no matter how you coach your words, you are still saying something that is ludicrous. You follow me? So I apologize for getting all worked up about this, but this is something that's been bothering me for a long time. And I feel this is necessary to get across in order to really start talking about what I really want to talk about with Bioshock, my favorite aspect of Bioshock, in fact, which is why I wanted to start with this. You see, going back to what I said initially, if I wanted to show communism as the bad guys, I would go to an extreme, because an extreme is by its nature fictional. Now, yes, there are some extremes in real life, but those are so statistically insignificant. Their percentile is mathematically non-consequential. You understand? So when you have, instead of one guy or three guys or 20 guys within a particular group, particular philosophy, particular organization who are hardcore, extreme, no really, that's more like real life. When you have all of them, all 7 million or whatever, or 7,000 or whatever percentage or number you want to use here, that is fiction because it doesn't work that way. Forgive me for talking for just a second about something. One of my players pointed out the very real corollary in my game, my D&D game I'm doing, between what was happening with Vilkas Goldtongue and most of the residents of the Hlelu house, and what happened with a certain Adolf Hitler and a pre-World War II Germany. Now, as usual, I didn't intend any such corollary. I'm not going to deny it was there because, duh, I'm human, and that's what writers do. We write what we know. But I wasn't intentionally ripping off, is my point. But it was an interesting corollary because one of the points I was trying to get across is that House Hlelu as a whole is not to blame. And I may not have conveyed this in the videos, but one of the things that both Redoran, especially Redoran, but Telvanni as well, have taken as writ for the last several years is that Hlelu equals bad guys. They were applying the exact same extreme generalization to the other side that was being applied to them. And it wasn't until they started encountering members of the opposing side and started interacting with them that they started to realize how silly that was, and to realize that what the other side was made of was people. And a few extremists. You follow me here? I applaud the people who made Bioshock. I suddenly can't think of their names. I'm sorry. I can't think of the developers' names. Because what they did is they showed why extremism okay, I'm actually going to take a few steps. I don't get to that point yet. I applaud them for showing several different philosophies, several different viewpoints, several different ideologies within Bioshock, and showing all of them as extremes. Every single one of the major things that have sparked so much philosophical discussion on so many boards and so many TV tropes page and wiki posts and all that fun stuff were all extremes, and it was done so very much on purpose for a reason I'll get to at the end of this point. I'm sorry, I'm really building up to this. Forgive me. But even ignoring that main point, doing so automatically takes it a step further away from real life. And when you're doing a game like Bioshock, I think that's a good thing personally. Now I've said in the past that I have a preference for fiction over reality. Not literally. I mean, obviously, I don't want to live in Star Trek. That would be terrible. But my point is that in my fiction, I want it to be fiction. The more realistic it is, the less I tend to like it. Again, that is a generalization, but percentage-wise, that tends to be true. I prefer things to be fictional in my fiction, right? But even ignoring that, when you are talking about something that is so fundamentally present here in everyday life, I think that it is a better idea, personally, in order to go to such a fictionalized extreme, in order to emphasize the fact that you are not saying communism is bad. I keep using that example, but you get the point. Um, let's use religion, okay? I know I don't like talk about religion, but let's go ahead and just pick Christianity and Muslim and Buddhism, okay? These three, okay? Because I know a decent amount about those three religions. And let's go ahead and say, which is irrelevant, I guess, but whatever. Let's say that you wanted to portray, in the Bioshock fashion, a perfect city that had been built based on these three religions working in harmony, right? And then let's say you wanted to portray the bad guys, one from each, okay? Now, these bad guys were extremists of their philosophy. The Christians were completely intolerant people who had no understanding of treat thy neighbor as thyself, that kind of thing, right? The Buddhists were far too severe in their approach towards absolute neutrality or something like that. And, of course, the Muslims were psychotically violent or whatever. Just caricaturizing it, not actually being something representative of it, but rather being representative of what a fictionalized extreme therefore would be, and indeed, in so doing, showing how stupid it is when people in real life go to such ridiculous extremes. Forgive me for getting worked up about this, but that is exactly what Bioshock does, and it does it for the most beautiful reason possible. Yes, I'm finally getting to the point. It does so to show that extremism itself is the problem. Bioshock, in its entirety, is ultimately a story about how moving to any given extreme is a bad thing. And I personally agree with this, as I've said many, many times. I believe very strongly in the concept of moderation. In it depends on the circumstances, it depends on the moment, it depends on what's happening now, dynamically, rather than everything must be, wah. That's something I agree with, and that's something I really latched onto in this game, is the whole concept that everything went to hell because the people involved that were pulling the strings were pulling it way, way too far to the opposing sides, and it just snapped. And the whole thing went to hell, more or less literally. Pardon me, I need a drink. Well, that is, without question, my favorite aspect of Bioshock right there. Because everything you see, I talked over in Half-Life 2 about how they would use visual elements and audio elements in order to emphasize the story without coming out and saying it just like this. And this is something Bioshock does very well as well. This is something they do very well. They portray a society that was near beatific and crumbled to absolute destruction within such a ridiculously short period of time, and make it actually believable, make it plausible. You know what I mean? And that is extremely well done. I have nothing but praise for the art design and the direction of this game, and the way it was presented to us. Breath. Now, there is something I want to get off my chest here, okay? I mentioned this back in Half-Life 2, and I have mentioned this before. Horror games are not my thing. I just don't enjoy them. I I don't really have anything else to add there, to be honest with you. I don't care for that sort of thing. Now, I have also said in the past that there are different kinds of horror. My least favorite would be pure gore horror. House of the Dead would be a good example of that. A game that otherwise is simple, mindless fun, nevertheless is extremely gory and unpleasant in that fashion. Now, yes, I know House of the Dead is arguably not a horror game series. It's more like a comedy series. It was the first one that came to mind. Something that's just ludicrously gory to the point of parody. But, okay, hang on. Let me try and think of a better example here. Okay, I've got one. A game that is otherwise a good game, but not something I like because of its presentation. Dead Space and Dead Space 2. Mostly Dead Space 1. I actually never actually played through all of Dead Space 2 because I didn't like it. It was my thing. But Dead Space is an extremely visceral, extremely brutal, extremely bloody, extremely gory game. That's not my thing. It never has been. That type of horror is something I don't enjoy. That does not mean I'm saying Dead Space is a bad game. I know I keep saying that, but I want to keep emphasizing it just in case someone hasn't seen the other 15 times I say it and sees this like, oh my god, he's saying Dead Space is a bad game. No. All I'm saying is that's not my thing. Now, psychological horror, like, say, Silent Hill 2, beautiful example, incredibly done game, brilliantly atmospheric. Again, not a game I enjoy, because it is extremely well done atmospheric horror, and that's not my thing. Psychological horror, I tend to get into that a lot more. Now, what I call psychological horror is not actually the proper term for it. A good example of this would be the first, say, half hour of Half-Life 2, when you are basically helpless and you don't actually know what's going on, but everything is implying just how bad things are. The kind of horror that makes you really think about it. And it's not the presentation itself is not horrifying. It's what you're thinking about that's horrifying, okay? I do tend to enjoy that type of horror. Now, Bioshock is kind of a combination of all of the three I just mentioned here. So, I have to be completely honest. I did not enjoy Bioshock that much, to be completely honest with you. Let me make this again absolutely clear. I think Bioshock is an amazing game. In fact, I do actually, if I enjoyed it personally, I would qualify it in my own art category. As is, I do without question think it is a game that should be deserving of that type of category for someone who actually enjoys that sort of thing. But, well, let me take a step back here, okay? I played Shock and System Shock 2, most especially System Shock 2. I barely remember System Shock 1, to be honest with you. I played System Shock 2 multiplayer. Did you know you could do that? You could actually co-op through the game. It's a great option. Now, System Shock 2 had pretty bad graphics, all things considered, even for the time, and so most of the elements of that were not very visceral. However, at the same time, System Shock 2 was incredibly viscerally horrifying. Do you know why? Because they had these things that were audio logs. Now, if you've played Bioshock and have not played System Shock 2, you should know automatically what I'm talking about. These the post Doom logs, that just tell everything about how absolutely horrible this situation is and was. The catch here, and one of the main reasons why I have a problem with visceral horror, even when it's audio, in the case that I'm exemplifying now, is I have an extremely good imagination. I know it's a shock. But no, in all seriousness, I have an extremely powerful imagination, and there are many times I wish I didn't. Because when I hear something that is very well presented, something that has been very well made, something that has been actually, sounds very similar to what it is, they're not showing me anything. My mind is filling in the pieces quite well, thank you, and that's part of the problem. System Shock 2 bothered me so hard because I could picture and see and almost feel what was happening in those audio logs. I still, to this day, remember several of those with absolute abject terror. Because, oh my god, Those were just, ugh. And every single one of those was in service of this overall setting of just sheer tense atmosphere, and it was very well done. Don't mistake me. I did beat the game after all, and of course the ending, the last line, the only line the player character says, made me laugh so hard it was just a complete mood. It was not just a mood breaker; it was a mood emphasizer, if that makes any sense. I'm not going to spoil it. For anybody who knows what I'm talking about, If you don't, go look at Shodan's death scene, and you'll see what I mean. But in Bioshock, we have the exact same concept. It has been said many times that Bioshock is System Shock 2, except with a few different features, and I actually tend to agree, with a couple of exceptions. The extremism thing I just mentioned is a good exception of that. The whole Shodan plot and what was going on with the AI could be argued to be an extreme, but it wasn't presented like that. It wasn't presented, at least not deliberately, with that sort of air. The other thing, which I'll talk about in just a moment here, is another thing with regards there too. But overall, I think Bioshock is enough of its own game to be qualified as its own game. I only mention it in relation to System Shock 2 to emphasize the fact that I've been down this road before. And I went into Bioshock knowing, okay, it's the kind of game that I personally had to play with the light on. Because otherwise my brain would go into overdrive because I just have too powerful an imagination. I can't imagine that I am the only person like that there have to have been others of you out there who listen to these audio logs and just cringe. Let me give you an example, a direct one. Bioshock. I forget the exact wording. It's the freak scientist guy, the cosmetic surgeon, who you hear these. Oh God, I'm just remembering it. You hear these sounds as he's hacking away at whatever, and the nurse is like, "Doctor, doctor, what are you doing?" He's like, "Help me, some Greek goddess, I can't remember which. Help me, I can't just. They won't stop moving," and it's just. Oh my God! And there was just something absolutely freaking terrifying about that. I'm actually mixing up two into one. I actually don't recall specifically. I just remember the tone and the background noises and ugh. That's the kind of thing that Bioshock has. Now, if you happen to be into that kind of, I personally would qualify that as both visceral and psychological horror, which is one of the reasons I am partially into it and one of the reasons why I partially cringe away from it. But nevertheless, it is incredibly well done. I will never argue that point. It is beautifully presented, and anybody who doesn't go through Bioshock and actually looks at all the audio logs and finds all the audio logs, in my opinion, is doing themselves a disservice because so much of the atmosphere and the setting and the buildup of that game revolves around those audio logs, and it is a beautiful way to present that type of horror to the player. And I've already given you the reason why, because it's mostly up here. They don't have to show you all these horrible things happening. They don't have to show you the city breaking down and turning into absolute nightmare. All they have to do is present a few voice clips of key moments for you to listen to, and your brain fills in the rest of the holes. I've talked about this before. Again, Half-Life 2 is another game that has done this. I hate to keep comparing the two, but there are some very obvious comparisons, in my opinion, between the two, in a good way. Because both games bothered to treat you like you had a brain. They treated you like you can put this thing together yourself. We don't have to handheld you step by step through the line. Now, of course, I would be remiss if I did not talk about the very meta aspect of Bioshock. In fact, I imagine that's the thing that has been most talked about Bioshock with regards to the total deconstruction of the nature of linear gameplay within the video game logic. I talked about video game logic briefly before in Half-Life 2. This is the game I really want to tackle that issue in, because this is the game which actually took video game logic and just kind of put it on display for the gamer and said, "Here, look, it's right here." I've talked before that, okay, let me just start from the beginning. Let me just assume you didn't watch my Half-Life 2 video for whatever reason, or you don't recall what I was talking about. Gamer logic involves the concept, what it really boils down to is understanding the rules of the specific game you're playing, okay? For example, in Guild Wars, the first one, you can't jump. Therefore, by simple logical definition, if anything is preventing you from going someplace, a fence, or a chest-high wall, or a small little chasm, you know, through gamer logic, that there is no way to get there unless you can find a way around, okay? If you are playing Final Fantasy VI, you know that there are certain objects that are going to have the possibility of containing items in addition to chests. We see that in the tutorial room right out of Narsh, for example, even if you didn't catch up to that already. And so that is something we do understand, but we don't randomly check every wall or every chunk of chair or furniture or whatever other backdrop. We only check the things that are pots or I actually can't think of any other examples, but pots, barrels, that kind of thing. We check barrels is a good example. We check those kind of things because we have by gamer logic the understanding that that is what is possible, while everything else is not. A lot of games tend to play with that concept by letting the solution to something be something that is not otherwise presented as possible. I mentioned this briefly back in Half-Life 2, the car battery thing. And for reference, whoever pointed it out, no, I didn't know there were two other batteries that you could find throughout the area. That's actually really amusing to me, because the car battery thing made at least a degree of sense to me. I had no idea you could actually find additionals. That's awesome. But anyways, my point is gamer logic is something that ultimately is about not questioning, if that makes any sense. Now, I'm not calling gamers stupid. I'm not calling gamers dull sheep or whatever stupid random term you want to put onto that, okay? Let's make this clear. What it means is that a gamer tends to apply their intellect towards the limitations that they believe exist, okay? Thus, when you are playing a linear game, it does not occur to you to not continue doing the story. Ultimately your choice is either keep going or turn the game off, right? That's what a linear game is. We've been used to this since Mario Brothers, for goodness sakes. Yeah, the original. So what Bioshock then did was took gamer logic and gave reason behind it, and on top of that, gave us reason to think about it, gave us reason to question it. Unfortunately, and I hate to say this, because I could not possibly figure out how they could do this without extensive effort, they did not give us meta reason. to question it. Now, let me explain a little bit. For those of you who don't know the big twist, I'm about to spoil it, so I really hope you go and play the game before hearing this part. I tend to give that warning often, but I feel it's worth noting, especially for games that I consider to be of absolute high quality, such as this one. One of the big twists in Bioshock is the fact that the character you're playing has been brainwashed, effectively mind controlled, to the point where if you hear a catchphrase, "Would you kindly," you have to obey whatever suggestion comes thereafter. And I'll talk about that within setting terms in a little bit more, just a bit here. For now, we're talking about the meta aspect, the aspect to us, the people playing the game. That obviously is beautiful because it made a very literal in-lore reason as to why it is this game is linear, which is something almost no game does. Almost every other game just kind of goes with the whole linearity thing because they know you as a gamer with gamer logic will do so. This game gave you a reason for it, and simply by bringing it up, again, bringing it up to the forefront here, just putting it right here, it said, here, look at this. Now, it didn't say, this is very important, Bioshock did not say, this is wrong. Bioshock did not say, this is something you should, question, this is not how you should be, this you should change it to be like this, or whatever. No, no, no. All it did was put it up here. Didn't say a thing. Just put it right here. And that's it. And that was sufficient, not only sufficient, I think that was a brilliant method of doing it because the whole point was to make us question it without presumption, if you know what I mean. Too often a game will get preachy about a subject, or even if it's not actually full-on preachy, even if it's not on a soapbox, it will lean in one direction or another, if nothing else in positive towards negative, or towards negative. In this case, you could argue, I suppose, that this was a negative thing, but only in the context within the lore, not within the context of the player, if you follow me. I want to keep these completely distinct, because I'll talk about this part later. This part over here, with regards to us, was portrayed in a completely neutral fashion. It was just putting it up on a sign, just so we could notice it. And then it put it back down again, and we got on with the gameplay. But that simple element, simply by doing so, was something that had almost never been done before. Yes, it has been done before, obviously. And I know I'm not going to name examples because I don't feel like getting into it. But it done it in such a beautiful manner, and in such an overtly powerful manner. And this is something very important, it automatically added, at the very least, an additional replay value to Bioshock, because playing through it the second time, knowing, changes everything. I've talked before, well, I'll get to that later, But I just want to emphasize that the way they presented this concept of gamer logic being something that should be thought about at all, whether positive or negative, whether it should be changed, whether it should be enforced, just the fact that we are thinking about it was something that I do definitely credit Bioshock, because that brought it so far into the forefront, if you know what I mean. So I would like to admit, well, okay. Yes, I thought about gamer logic before this. This is something that's occurred to me many times before. But that's just because that's my nature. I tend to analyze things, if that's not obvious by my huge videos about games and TV shows and whatnot, I tend to think things a lot. It's my nature. But I didn't know very many friends. In fact, I only knew one other friend who actually had already conceived of this concept of enforced linearity gameplay being something that should be questioned once. One other person. And he's a good friend of mine, and he's been a friend of yours. But it's interesting because that's kind of the point by itself, isn't it? The fact that we just so automatically and readily accept the fact that, well, this is a linear game, and here's our limitations. Here's the path, and here's our abilities, and here's our capacities, and here's what we can do. And every time, there have been games that, for example, will do this improperly. For example, they'll have this. This is what we can do, and this is what we can't do. But for one little section here, let's see if I can get my finger stretched. There we go. For one little section here, this over here, this is hard to do, is the solution for this one puzzle. And we do this one little sideways thing in order for the puzzle, and then it's back to this. A lot of games have done that over the years. Very few have advertly said, by the way, and actually pointed it out to us like that. So, I gotta give Bioshock credit for that, of course. Now, let's talk about it in lore terms, okay? In lore terms, what we have is a unique situation in which someone has been... the lore relationship is itself somewhat meta, despite the fact that I keep segregating these two. But it's not meta in the same manner, if that makes any sense, because the meta thing over here, the gamer thing over here, was simply to point it out. The relation to the gamer was the acknowledgement that this is a linear game, and therefore the player doesn't have any choice as to what to go through, and neither does the character. And giving the character a reason for that actually made a lot of sense. If you see where I'm going with this, giving the character a very solid lore bound reason as to why it is they're going down this linear adventure was something that was extremely well done, even ignoring the whole meta aspect over here. And there are two scenes which are incredibly powerful in Bioshock, and I bet you know exactly what both of them are right now. One of them is an audio log you find of yourself when you were younger, and you have been basically brainwashed at this point, um, in the audio log. And the guy says, "Would you kindly break that little puppy's neck?" And the boy starts crying. Again, this is that beautiful usage of audio and beautiful usage of the audio logs in order to get the story across. Because we can automatically picture and see the problem. We don't have to we don't have to have it explained to us. We know that child is so distraught over the thought of having to break that puppy's neck because he believes he has to. He has already at this point been pushed to the point of brainwashing, and he needs to break that neck, but he really, really doesn't want to. And at that point in time, he's still aware of the brainwashing, if you follow me. He's still aware of the fact that he is being compulsed, but he very much doesn't want to. And that is extremely powerful. And the utter horrific mundanity in the gentleman's voice as he's telling him, he's just saying it so politely, "Would you kindly break that little puppy's neck?" It's so horrifying in its own way, in its own casual neglect and disregard for basic decency and morality, that we don't need anything else to understand just how incredibly horrific and terrifying and important, powerful that this scene is. That audio log is without question the one that I consider to be the best one in the whole game. And not very far after that, what do we have but the most well-known scene in the game in which the reveal is pulled. And, what's his face? Not Fontaine. Or is it Fontaine? It's Fontaine or Ryan. I get the two confused. The one guy, orders you with the brainwashing thing to kill him, which is hilarious because you then actually have to, kill him because it's a linear game. A man chooses, a slave obeys, that whole thing, which emphasizes not only his mentality, but his mentality taken to its furthest extreme. Again, getting back to that extremes point I mentioned earlier, this is a man who chose to die under his own terms simply to prove a point. You can argue that there were other motivations, and I agree that there probably were other complications within his mentality, but I think this man was so far gone, so extremist, so gone, so that he really did genuinely believe that making this point, that a man chooses and a slave obeys, was more important than his continued existence, and so he demonstrated this by forcing you, the slave, to do what he, the man, chose in killing him. And there is something incredibly powerful in that. And it's a brilliantly done scene. If you haven't played this game, have no interest in playing this game, I strongly recommend you look up this scene on YouTube because my God. Now, what did I want to go with next? Hang on, I've been kind of on a roll here, like adrenaline roll or whatever you want to call that. This video probably won't be very long because I feel like there's so little I can add to this. For example, you'll notice I'm barely talking about the gameplay at all. It's partially because I played System Shock 2. I mean, the gameplay was just, okay, yep, same thing. There's the hacking, and there's the sort of leveling up system, and all you really need to do is power up this one power and be like... One thing I will actually give Bioshock credit in, though, is that there were multiple not quite to the Deus Ex extreme, and yes, I know you don't hear me talk about that game very often. I'm talking about the original Deus Ex, by the way. In the original Deus Ex, you had the capacity to choose just about any path. You could specialize in anything, and there would be a method in which to complete the game with that, if you follow me. If you chose to specialize, I don't actually remember the specializations other than, hacking and the guns, but there were several, and the game was specifically structured so that any given one would work. Most games don't do that. Even the most recent Deus Ex didn't really do that to a certain degree. But Bioshock was, at very least, I think, moderately successful in this matter because no matter what path you choose, no matter what plasmids you chose, there was the capacity in order to beat the game with your particular style, with your particular method. And as I've said many, many, many times before, I am a huge fan of options. I am a huge fan of choice within a video game. Indeed, let's be honest with ourselves, that's kind of the main point of a video game. It is interactive media. Now, I'm not saying this to put down linear gameplay, I'm just saying I prefer, I prefer Mega Man 2 to Super Mario Bros. 2. Why? Well, actually, that's a bad example. Mega Man 1 to Super Mario Bros. 1. Why? Because in Mega Man, I can choose which weapon I'm using at any given time. In Mario Bros., I cannot. While the Mario Brothers was without question the classic that started an entire multitude of generations, plural, of video gaming, it is my opinion that the former is a superior game, if for absolutely no other reason than the option of choice being added. Now, I know that's a bad analogy, and I literally just came up with it right now off the top of my head. I thought of like 3 or 4 others as I was thinking about that, and all of them didn't actually pan out, so forgive me. But my point remains that the method by which they allowed you to customize your character within Bioshock, I think, was a good idea, especially since this is a game that practically encourages, at the very least, a second playthrough, as I mentioned earlier. That's the thing I wanted to talk about. That's what I'm gonna. I knew there was something else. I wanted to talk about that later, and this is now later. It is extremely difficult to pull off a type of story that is best enjoyed twice. It's a very specific formula. Basically, it has to do with putting hints to something that you basically do not have the capacity to catch because you're not looking for that specific thing up until a reveal, and then you continue on. At that point, you go back and rewatch, and all of a sudden everything makes sense because those points are now something that you understand. That's the basic formula. There are several movies, there are several books, and there are many video games that have done this format. I'm not going to list any other examples because we're already talking about one of the best examples right now, Bioshock. You go back and you listen to the "Would you kindly" thing throughout so many things, and the guy, even when he's talking so casually, he slips it in. It becomes such a mundane thing as to the way he's talking. Oh God, I really wish you would kindly, that kind of thing. He just kind of slides it right into the way he's talking, so that you barely even notice it. And indeed, at the time, I myself, for example, had no reason to suspect the phrase "would you kindly" meant anything because it just sounded like the way the guy talked, which is the point. Not only that, even ignoring the "would you kindly" thing, which is the most obvious thing, going back and looking at those logs and hearing what actually happened, knowing now what actually happened with what caused the entire city to dissolve and the power struggle between the two individuals and everything involved therewith, going back and rereading all the logs and going through the areas and interacting with all the people, well, if you could call them people at that time. I'm talking about. I'm sorry, I am misspeaking. I don't mean interacting with the people. I mean interacting with the setting and with the offices and the hallways and all the different signs you see of what happened here makes so much more sense and is more of a full experience because now you know exactly what happened, if you follow me. And it's a very difficult type of story to pull that off, to pull off. I'm getting too excited. I'm talking. I'm misspeaking here. I apologize. I like this game, if it's not obvious, even though I don't like this game. Yes, really, that's exactly what I mean. That's not a misspeak. I like this game even though I don't like this game, because Bioshock is an amazing game. So is System Shock 2, for that matter. I recommend it. Now, Air. Like I said, though, I don't want to talk too much additional about the gameplay, other than the fact that I think they did a good job of it. I do want to talk about the moral choice element, okay? Now, I have to put that in quote-unquotes. A lot has been said about the black and white moral choice code type of thing that video games tend to do. It is, in my opinion, this is one of the very, very few things that Yahtzee and I tend to actually agree on. It is my opinion that very few games actually pull off a moral choice system properly. There have been a few, but most of the time it either feels vestigial or too extremist. And despite what I said earlier, going extreme from good to evil is completely different from going to extreme with a real life allegory such as a political party or a particular country or a style of philosophy. That's different than simple basic concepts such as "I am here to help everyone on the earth," Mario kind of character, or "I am here to destroy everything in the most horrific manner." Uh, yeah, I don't know, Light Yagami kind of thing going on here, As I try to think of the most evil character I can think of off the top of my head. I tend to disagree with the extremism in that usage thereof, and in my opinion, for example, Mass Effect and Mass Effect 2 both did the moral choice system very correctly, especially because they were not mutually exclusive. Some games don't do it quite as well. Most of the KOTOR games, despite the fact that I really enjoy them, I think that the light and dark dichotomy could have been done better, in my opinion, especially since, well, let's not even get into that. My point is, Bioshock chose a very unusual aspect of it. It feels very vestigial in Bioshock's case, and that's one of the reasons I use the quote-unquote thing, because it's almost not a moral choice system. Let me make this clear for those of you who don't know the difference, really. If you choose to kill any little sister in the entire game, even one, you get the bad ending. If you choose to kill all of them, you get the bad ending with worse dialogue, or you know what I mean. If you choose to save all of them, you get actually a pretty cool ending, in my opinion. And yes, I know many of you out there find it irritating or unlikable or whatever word you want to use, that I tend to prefer good endings or happy endings or whatever you want to call it. That is admittedly just my preference. But even ignoring that preference, I do think the good ending in Bioshock's case was actually done very well. I think it was a beautiful analogy of the game as a whole, because the whole point there is not just the fact that rather than go to the extremes, you what you could have done, you pulled yourself back and you see people, instead of being any given extreme, you see them just living their lives, just being people, not being tools, not being, saints, not being demons or whatever, not engaging in horrific acts. They're just living completely normal, ordinary lives and being happy with it. And at the very end, all of them are happy to see you go as their father, when you yourself are old and dying, because now you have also lived your life, just a normal, ordinary life, because you have been freed of the shackles of extremism with the brainwashing and whatnot. I liked that. I liked that analogy. I liked the way it presented itself. I thought it was very well done, it's good ending or bad ending. I did not like the bad ending nearly as much, because that felt a lot more like they were actually being like, "Mwahaha, you are evil, yes, good, good," that kind of a thing, which struck me as almost saccharine, for lack of a better term for it. And I also found it personally a little bit irritating that there were basically two endings, and if you mess up at all, you get the bad ending. Something about that bothered me. I know this is a long, extensive game, and I know game development is a horrific process, but in my perfect, idealized world with infinite resources and time, I would have preferred a gradient ending. Maybe having the one we did see as the good ending being, you save all of them, and maybe seeing the one we saw as the bad ending with the bad dialogue being the one if you kill all of them, and have a few in the middle. Have a few in-betweenies here. Have something where the surviving little sisters decide that they have to stop you because you yourself have started to become corrupted by Adam and blah blah, something like that maybe. Or maybe having one where you end up being so corrupted that the few who are remaining can't stop you, and you end up either destroying them or taking them over and forcing them to work for you, just like all the other evil people have forced them. Just some layers in here would have been nice. I don't mean to sound like I'm complaining, because ultimately I'm not, if that makes any sense. It's just something I was a little bit disappointed by, because I admit freely that I tend to be affected by a game's ending. I admit this. This has been true since forever. To give you an excellent example, Mega Man 2 and Mario Brothers 3, both good old NES games, in my opinion, let's go even older, Mega Man 2 and Mario Brothers 2, both had, in my opinion, really cool endings, especially for the NES time, and my enjoyment of those games was enhanced by having a good ending. By contrast, Mario Brothers 1, not to pick on the game again, didn't exactly have a stellar ending, and actually, Mega Man 1 had a pretty good ending, especially for the NES times too, so I can't pick on that. I'm trying to think of other NES games that have bad endings, other than Bad Dudes. Are you a bad enough dude to save the president? Alright, let's have a cheeseburger! And there you go, there's the intro and the end of the game. I just said it to you in 2 sentences. I freely admit that ever since forever, I tend to be affected by an ending for a game. I also freely admit that part of that is because I've been around when video games didn't have endings, before the NES era. And so I tend to enjoy it when there's some kind of cap to things, right? And so when I see an ending that I enjoy or is fulfilling, I'm like, yes. When I see an ending that at the very least is promising, Mass Effect 2 is a great example here. The ending was very short and very sweet, and it was very much, especially if you made everyone live. Everyone's like, yeah, we're all ready to go, and we're going to go, and the Reapers are coming, and da-da-da-da. It was very short. It wasn't very extensive, but it was still good because all it was a big ramp up and to hype you up for Mass Effect 3, ironically. Okay, I'm with that. Even if you got the bad ending in Mass Effect 2, when it shows you as Shepard putting your hand on the coffins and all that sort of thing, that was still excellently done. That was still a good ending, if you follow my logic here. I apologize for banging on this point, but my point is, the better the ending presentation is in a game, the more impact it tends to have on me. I admit this. This is just my opinion and my preference on the matter. I'm going to let this go because the more I talk about it, the more it feels like I'm complaining when really I'm not, because I liked the good ending of Bioshock. I just wish it wasn't so dichotomized in a game that's all about not being dichotomized. Other things to talk about. Okay, I talked about that. I didn't actually make a list this time. I wanted to go from the heart on this one. I try. You probably noticed I try to do this for games I really, really enjoy. The only reason I had a list for Half-Life 2 was I literally played the game right before recording it, and I wanted to keep some notes. Obviously, I haven't played Bioshock over the last couple of days. Um, One of the really big things I like about Bioshock is it's probably one of the best examples of the one-winged angel concept I've talked about earlier. One of the things I defend about the one-winged angel concept is the idea that the reason the question tends to be asked if the last boss could turn into the super ultra doom form, why don't they do it earlier and just win? The answer is in a good game, because doing so is something that is generally considered to be a bad thing for the villain as well. Either it will burn them out or it will destroy their mind or whatever. Ultimately, in many ways, they are effectively killing themselves in order to kill you as one last ditch effort. I've talked about this before. Bioshock is one of the most direct examples of that I've ever seen in a video game. Um, Ryan or Fontaine, or whichever one he is, I'm sorry, I really do get the two confused. Right at the end there, injects himself with such a ridiculous amount of Adam that he basically goes berserko, turns into this horrifying thing that you have to then fight. Now, from Resident Evil. No, I'm sorry. But in all honesty, my point is that this was actually very well done for several reasons. First of all, is the most obvious one that I just mentioned to you, because this is the one-winged angel concept in a nutshell. This guy has basically just given up on all his ambitions, all his goals, all his plans, all his future thoughts, anything he ever wanted to do. He has given it all up for the sake of killing you. He has been pushed past the line. He has been pushed past the point of no return. He is now at the point where all he has left is petty vengeance, and he is willing to sacrifice it all just to bring you down. He may not consciously even be aware of that, and it is my opinion that he is not in Bioshock, that he doesn't realize that he is already over the line, that he is already to this point of total loss. And and that makes it all the more sweeter, that makes it all the more poignant, because he doesn't even realize that he is so far gone. Because he is so far gone, you understand? And so this is, like I said, probably one of the most textbook examples, in a good way, of the one-winged angel concept right here. Second reason I like it is because it gives us a properly epic big boss fight for the end of the game. And I've said before many times that the final boss of a game should deserve special recognition in some manner or another. It is a very rare game that can get away with not having a proper final boss fight, in my opinion. Extremely rare. Half-Life 2 comes to mind. And actually, I can't think of another one. So whatever. But I've always been a huge proponent of the final boss concept, the final boss theorem, which I've talked about most strongly way back in Final Fantasy 3 and 4 reviews. If you haven't watched those, that it should be something special, and this was certainly special, and it was awesome, and it was pursuitably epic. The third reason I like it is because it actually gives a proper reason for the little sisters to matter in gameplay terms in addition to in lore terms. Now, some of you out there are probably thinking, but you can get more Adam if you harvest the Little Sister. To which I respond, do you actually need that much actual Adam? I don't know, maybe it was just me or the style I was playing, but harvesting the Little Sisters was never something that was appealing to me, even not knowing about the game, even ignoring the morality of the situation, because I didn't need the Adam. I was fine. And so, to me, it was an obvious choice. Oh, of course, it's like, okay, let me give you an example. It's like if I'm playing a D&D game or any type of RPG like that where gold is a common medium. An Elder Scrolls is another excellent example. You know what? I got an example. There's actually a scene in Neverwinter Nights 1 where you're on the docks and you find this guy and you can go through these dialogue options in order to talk to him, and he's like, I've got nothing left. I've got nothing left. And at this point in time, I've already got about 1,000 gold lying around in my pocket. And this guy has literally lost his home, his family, and everything except the clothes on his back. And through your dialogue options, you can actually say, give me the clothes off of your back. To me, even if you ignore the severe horribleness of such an act, that doesn't make sense, even from a purely logistical perspective, because I've already got 1,000 gold. What do I need your 10 gold for? It doesn't mean anything to me. Here, take some of mine, for God's sakes. God, I mean, really. So my point is that with the usage of the Little Sisters in the final boss fight, it was the first time I personally felt that they actually had a point gameplay-wise in addition to lore-wise, and I was actually rather pleased by that, because I remember my first time around thinking, what's the point of these girls? I guess it's just a lore thing, okay. So that was nice. I think that's basically all I have on the final boss. It was pretty well done. I also want to add one other thing with regards to Bioshock here. I feel like I'm running out of things to talk about. It's such a shame. One of the things I really like is what I call the background fleshing out thing. I've talked about this before with regard to a few games. It's the idea that there's a character you only see once or twice or thrice, or indeed you never see. You only read about or see the actions that they have perpetuated or propagated. And we actually nevertheless learn a great deal about that character. That character gets enough characterization that we could actually say, oh, well, they're this kind of person with this kind of mentality and blah, 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 blah. Bioshock does this very well with quite a few NPCs, notably the cosmetic doctor I talked about towards the beginning. But in general, there are several NPCs whose names I could not possibly remember off the top of my head, who receive a significant amount of characterization based purely on the extras detritus of their characters. We never see them. We never interact with them, but we learn a great deal about them, and I actually rather like that. In some cases, they don't even have names, I don't believe, now that I'm thinking about it. Several of the audio logs, for example. And yet still, we learn a great deal about these people, relatively speaking. I mean, obviously we don't get a novel about their backstory, but we do learn enough in order to actually have a picture of, well, that's NPC B over there, and they were this kind of person, and they were kind of easygoing, and they had some issues, and they didn't really agree with all this, but they were, at their heart, a core blah blah blah, and just stuff like that. Very well done. Now, I do feel I want to talk about one other thing here right at the end, and that is the reason why I am not talking about Bioshock 2 and what I will be saying about Bioshock 3, or whatever they're calling it. I actually can't remember off the top of my head. Bioshock Infinite, I believe. Bioshock 2 was a game that, on the face of it, looked like an incredibly bad idea to me. When Bioshock 2 was coming out, I looked at that and I just kind of tilted my head. One of the main reasons why is Bioshock was a complete game in its whole. It started, it ended, it came full circle. There was no need for a sequel, there was no need to add on to it. It was done and it was good. And so I couldn't possibly figure out why there would be a sequel to that, right? Now, admittedly, I was thinking Bioshock 2 had something directly to do with Bioshock. Yes, I know it is in the same canon and has some connections, but let's be honest with ourselves. Bioshock 2 is a separate game, a separate story, a completely separate story that basically has nothing to do with Bioshock 1. Yes, I know it has some things to do with it, but you get my point. And that's actually in its favor, and one of the reasons why I've been more now that I've read up more and know more about Bioshock 3, I am much more excited about it when it's going to come out. Because, in my opinion, that's exactly what you should do with a system like this, with a series like this. I talked very recently in my first and, well, arguably my second, and only really lamentation video about the concept of franchises and the methods by which you could approach them. And one of the ways I talked about with regards to sequels in my Half-Life 2 review was that you can either take the original and expand upon it, make it better, or you can go in a completely different direction. This is one of the things that the Shock series in general has actually been pretty good about. System Shock and System Shock 2 were direct sequels, but System Shock 2 to Bioshock are completely different stories. They're completely segregated, even though ultimately, if you put them side by side, you could see the same basic outline here. Well, actually, it'd be probably more like this, but you get the point. Similarly, Bioshock and Bioshock 2, a little bit different, but ultimately, again, the same general outline. And this is what they're going to do again in Bioshock 3. And I think that is the correct choice. It's one of the reasons I do defend both 2 and the upcoming game, which isn't even out yet, but, here's hoping. And one of the reasons why I didn't want to talk about Bioshock 2 is ultimately, I'm not sure what else to say about that other than everything I've said about Bioshock 1, if that makes any sense, because most of what I've talked about hasn't been regarding the specific story of Bioshock 1, if you've noticed. It's been regarding its themes, its presentation, its style, and its execution. And I don't feel like there's anything I could really add to that. Maybe if I play Bioshock 2 a couple more times, which I don't have time for do right now, obviously, I will do that, but I just wanted to make it clear that I'm not reviewing Bioshock 2 not because it's a bad game or because I think it's worse, because it's this. I don't know how better to explain this. So, that being said, I'm going to go rest my throat for a bit and start working on my next video. I'll talk to you guys later.